the senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first of all, let me thank my colleague from South Carolina, Senator Graham, for his very kind words. I return the same kind of compliments to him for his great work in helping to build this bill and get us moved to this point. I'm going to make just a few remarks right now in response to some of the allegations and mischaracterizations that my colleagues on the other side have made about how this bill has been structured in terms of its evaluation and scoring. And then later I'm going to come and give a much longer speech, sorry sir, on the bill itself. But the things that were said this morning just have to be responded to. First of all, it is said that the reason that we are going to increase the debt ceiling in the bill is because we are spending so much money and driving the deficit up. Well, first of all, our bill drives the deficit down, not up. And secondly, the reason we are dealing with the debt ceiling in the bill is because under the previous administration's operations, the debt ceiling has already been breached. It was breached on January 2nd. And we are limping along with extraordinary measures, is what we call them here in Washington, to try to keep the government funded until Congress can extend the debt ceiling. This has nothing to do with President Trump. It happened before he even was sworn into office. It has nothing to do with this bill. It has to do with the profligate spending that drove us into a breach of the debt ceiling on January 2. Secondly, my colleagues on the other side try to characterize our choice of the current policy baseline as a gimmick and said it's never been done before. Well, they should have been more careful in their words, because the current policy baseline is currently utilized in the current CBO baseline for many spending programs. In fact, many spending programs, about $2.5 trillion of spending programs, are measured under the current treatment, which the Democrats have been using for decades, to make it so they don't have to count spending increases as an increase in the deficit. They are correct that that policy has never been applied to taxes before, because it was not intended to apply to taxes. That ruling and that system that was set up was intentionally designed to favor tax increases over spending cuts and to force Congress to increase taxes and increase spending. It was a strategy to achieve what we all know of as tax and spend. And no matter how they try to cover it over today in their debate, it comes down to this. They are furious that we refuse to raise taxes in America by $4.3 trillion on Americans. And they claim that our refusal to raise your taxes, America, is going to run up the deficit because they can't get $4 trillion more of your tax revenue into their pockets. Well, the first failure of that rationale is, if you believe that you give them $4.5 trillion by letting them raise your taxes again, if you believe they're going to use that to pay the debt down, let me tell you, there's not a tax increase that I've seen in this Congress in my lifetime that was used to pay the debt down. It was used to increase spending. It's called tax and spend. And it's that bias in our scoring system that we are fixing today. We are fixing it so that current policy is how you treat taxes, just like you treat $2.5 trillion of spending this year in your scoring system. We're evening the balance board between taxing and spending. And America should sigh a sigh of relief that finally we are fixing our scoring procedures so that we don't have a built-in drive to increase taxes. Let's put it another way. One of my colleagues said, you know, just even children can understand the difference between $1 trillion and $0. I think they can also understand that if you don't raise taxes, you're not changing the tax code. You're making it bring in the same revenue that it brought in before. You're not increasing the deficit. you're protecting their wallets. And the bottom line here is very simple. I think every American, at least 90% of them, intuitively understand that the refusal to let your taxes go up by $4 trillion is not a deficit increase. You are not the responsible. Us keeping your money in your pocket is not making you responsible for increasing the deficit. Deficit increases come when Congress keeps spending your money and never, ever controlling its spending. The problem is not a lack of revenue. It is too much spending. So let's make it clear. This is not a gimmick. The gimmick is the one that's been used for all these years. We're making a balance between the treatment of tax and spend so that those taxpayers in America have at least a fair chance against the rules of this chamber. Now, one other thing that I think needs to be made here is there was a lot of talk on the other side, and then I'll stop and bring my longer speech later. One other point that needs to be made here is that it was suggested that this has never been done before, even on taxes. Well, there's a president named President Obama who faced a similar situation like we face today. Only then, he was president when a huge tax cut that President Bush had accomplished was expiring. And all of those tax cuts that President Bush had been able to achieve were going to go away, and everybody's taxes were going to go up. And President Obama said, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So he put a bill out on the floor to stop those tax increases from happening. And he was attacked, actually, for increasing the deficit by not letting taxes go up. And President Obama, through his OMB deputy director, said that keeping tax policy current should be scored under a current policy, and that if his act in letting those tax increases be kept in place should be scored as current policy, not as a tax increase. So you've got one of your own presidents from the Democratic Party saying that letting existing tax law stay in place and protecting against huge tax increases on the American people is the appropriate approach to take. That current policy, and those are their words, current policy is the way we should treat tax policy. So I say to everybody in America who's been hearing all of the politics of fear about what we're doing here and running up the deficit, need to remember that only in Washington, D.C. is the refusal to raise your taxes an increase in the deficit. And we're not going to let that happen. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Of policy effects, and it gives politicians a means to claim they are being fiscally responsible without actually ever exercising any prudence whatsoever. Sometimes the predictions are off because a new Congress is elected and changes the law. Eric Schuler writes that for any projection of a 10-year budget to be accurate, the Congressional Budget Office has to assume that the law won't change for 10 years, even as most of the politicians that make the laws risk being replaced every 2 years, and all of them advocate for changes of one stripe or another. Schuler states that few in Washington will admit Congress has a knack for starting any proposed cuts in the later years while letting spending run wild in the immediate future. Sometimes these predictions are off by $1 trillion or so because the economy grew more slowly or more quickly than anticipated. Bruce Thompson, a former Senate aide and Assistant Secretary of Treasury, writes, the Congressional Budget Office miscalculated the deficit last year by $1 trillion. So in deciding whether to vote for any big, monstrous bill, it helps to ask the right question. To me, the most pertinent question is how will the bill affect the deficit in the next year? Currently, our deficit is estimated to be a little under $2 trillion this year. What will happen to the debt in 2026 if this bill passes? Well, using the math most favorable to the supporters of the bill, referred to as the policy baseline, the deficit in 2026 will still be $270 billion more than this year. So even using the math, even using the formulas that the supporters of the bill like, the deficit will grow by $270 billion next year. That's just not good if you profess to be fiscally conservative. Why will the deficit grow next year? Well, even if you argue that the 2017 tax cuts don't need to be counted in the calculation at all, the new tax cuts add up to $234 billion to the debt next year. In addition, the big not-so-beautiful bill adds new spending of over $500 billion, military, border, agricultural subsidies, etc. That spending is front-loaded and will be spent in the first 4 years of the 10-year window. Legislated spending is one of the few items in the bill that is exact. It isn't estimated. If they say they'll spend $500 billion, they're going to spend $500 billion, all in the first few years. So in order not to add to the deficit, the BBB, the big not-so-beautiful bill, has to have corresponding spending cuts to counter all the new spending. Unfortunately, the spending cuts are backloaded to the final 5 years of the 10-year window when several tax cuts expire and the spending increases are finished. In addition, elections occur every 2 years and could easily wipe out any perceived savings that might occur in the later years. The only real certainty in this budget drama are the budget years coming in the immediate future. It's the next year or two are the only things that are actually of any certainty. So if we analyze this bill from that perspective, we discover that the bill increases the debt by $500 billion in the first 5 years. This is not the CBO projection that Republicans have not liked. This is the projection they are using, says the debt will add $500 billion in the first 5 years. Now, they say somehow, miraculously, in the last 5 years, it gets to a $500 billion in savings. So it's $1 trillion shift from year 5 to year 10. The CBO scores it differently, not as encouraging, and says it adds over $3 trillion in debt. So which is it? Does this bill save $500 billion over 10, or does it add $3 trillion over 10? The truth is that anybody, that even a person with a magic crystal ball, it's anybody's guess. Which brings us back to maybe we have to judge the effects of the big, not-so-beautiful bill by looking at what happens to the debt next year. Supporters of the bill admit it adds $270 billion to the debt next year. That's the only thing we know for certain. We don't know what happens in year 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, but we know next year this bill will grow the deficit by $270 billion. In addition, the bill increases the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. What does that mean? That is an admission that they know they aren't controlling the deficit. They know that the ensuing years will add trillions more. So we're adding $2 trillion this year, but they're anticipating, the authors of the bill anticipating adding more than $2 trillion next year. That doesn't sound at all conservative to me, and that's why I'm a no.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, joining me on the floor are experts in the budget process, former chairs and ranking members, Senator Murray, who's been Senate Budget Chair from 2013 through 15, Senator Whitehouse, who's Senate Budget Chair 2023 through 2025, Senator Van Hollen, who was the ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee in 2011 through 2017. We're here to address a fundamental violation of the law, of Law 313, Section 313, and it is the set of rules for reconciliation. To try to summarize this in the simplest words possible, 100 senators voted to have a special fast-track, filibuster-free pathway solely for reducing the debt. First principle was no deficits could be created in a 10-year period. Our Republican colleagues blew that up in 1996 when they wanted to do a tax bill that would create massive deficits. Then, a second pillar was no deficits in any title of the bill in any year after the first 10 years. This bill right now, if this passes, that blows that up. And the third was use honest numbers, Congressional Budget Office numbers. I have a letter here from the Congressional Budget Office, and they say, the estimate is relative to CBO's January 2025 baseline. CBO is required to construct its baseline under the assumptions specified in the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. You get to be here for my second speech. I'm here to talk now about the centerpiece of this reconciliation bill, making the 2017 tax cuts permanent. The One Big Beautiful Bill prevents the largest tax hike in history and provides groundbreaking new tax relief for middle-class workers and families. This legislation permanently extends the Trump tax cuts, which proportionally benefited the middle class the most. If these tax cuts were allowed to expire, taxpayers in all income groups would see massive tax hikes. And a point that my colleagues on the other side seem to consistently forget or ignore is that the vast majority of them, $2.6 trillion worth of those tax cuts or tax increases, would fall on taxpayers making less than $400,000 per year. And the vast majority of that is on taxpayers making and earning in the middle and lower middle income categories. No, that one. But before I go on to discuss what would happen, I want to address an issue that is just a constant theme on the other side, and that is that this bill is going to be a huge increase in the deficit. Now here's a quick handwritten chart that my colleague from South Carolina made quickly to respond to them. You heard the previous speaker say that CBO has scored this bill to have a huge multi-trillion-dollar deficit increase. The fact is that CBO has scored this bill to have a $507 billion deficit reduction. You heard that right, a $507 billion deficit reduction. And later on in my remarks, I will point out that that score doesn't even take into account the growth in the economy and the revenue that will come to our Treasury from revitalizing and giving a boost to our economy. So now let's go to the next chart. What will happen if we don't do this? What will happen if we do what the Democrats are demanding that we do? And that is to let this tax increase happen so that they can say they're going to use it to pay the deficit down. The average family of four would see a tax hike of $1,700, and their child tax credit would be cut in half. 20 million small business owners would face massive tax hikes, with some of them facing rates as high as 43%. The standard deduction, which simplifies tax filing for 90% of Americans, would be cut in half. Small businesses and farms would see their death exemption cut in half. The Council of Economic Advisors warns us that this $4 trillion tax hike would also lead to an economic downturn and potential recessionary headwinds, noting that the impacts would disproportionately fall on young people, minorities, and workers without college degrees. We've been working for more than a year on legislation that prevents that outcome and provides an opportunity for us to have additional tax relief that is specifically targeted to benefit low and middle income families and workers. Despite the rhetoric of fear, our critics' rhetoric about tax cut as being for billionaires and corporations, the reality of this legislation prevents a massive tax hike across the board and overwhelmingly benefits middle-class households and job creators. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, this bill provides more than $600 billion, that's $600 billion more of new tax relief for hardworking Americans. How does it do that? $73 billion in inflation tax relief targeted at income brackets below $100,000 per year. $205 billion in tax relief to the 90% of taxpayers who claim the standard deduction. $93 billion in additional tax relief for seniors through a $6,000 bonus exemption. $124 billion investment in children of low and middle income families, in addition to the permanent doubled child tax credit. I'm going to say that again. The permanent doubled child tax credit. The significant tax relief we are providing to hardworking families includes permanent lower tax rates, letting Americans keep more of their hard-earned money, permanent increased and enhanced standard deduction, claimed by over 90% of taxpayers. On top of making that doubled child tax credit permanent, we are also increasing it for tens of millions of families. Tax relief for seniors in the form of a $6,000 bonus exemption for low and middle income seniors, slashing their tax burden. No tax on tips for millions of tipped workers like waitresses, barbers, hairstylists, and taxi drivers. No tax on overtime for millions of America's hourly workers who work overtime and keep America running. No tax on auto loan interest for new cars made in the United States, allowing the hardworking families of America to fully deduct auto loan interest on American-made cars. Enhanced 529 education savings accounts, making education expenses more affordable and accessible for families. New Trump savings accounts for newborns and children set up to the age of 18, building financial security for the next generation. We make child care more accessible and affordable for working families by enhancing the Child and Dependent Care Credit and the Dependent Care Assistance Program. The list goes on and on. We extend the paid family and medical leave credit and expand health savings and accounts for health care expenses. We repeal onerous IRS reporting requirements on gig workers, reduce the paperwork burden for small businesses, and much more. And all of this just on the individual side of the code. The business side of the tax code has the potential to generate phenomenal economic growth. When my Republican colleagues and I began talking about how to best extend and enhance
in other election news, Republican U.S. Representative Don
the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we agreed that one of our top priorities was to make it permanent. The reforms we made in 2017, including lower rates for corporations and small business owners, along with the international tax reforms, increased domestic investment, boosted economic growth, and increased take-home pay. A growing economy powered a strong labor market. Workers saw record wage growth, and the unemployment rate fell dramatically to the lowest in 50 years at 3.5%. Corporate inversions, which we used to debate endlessly, or businesses leaving America, became a thing of the past. They literally ended. And America became the place to do business again. Capital formation exploded in the United States. Restoring these critical business provisions and making them permanent is a key to driving additional growth and investment in the United States. For businesses that spur investment and economic activity across the country, this bill makes the 20% small business deduction permanent, enabling job creation and spurring local economic activity. Restores and makes permanent full expensing for domestic research and development, encouraging domestic innovation. Restores and makes permanent full expensing for new capital investments, like machinery and equipment, boosting domestic production. Restores and makes permanent interest deductibility, helping to finance critical domestic investments and keep America globally competitive. It includes full expensing for new factories and factory improvements to accelerate domestic manufacturing. Permanently renews and enhances the Opportunity Zone program, driving $100+ billion of investment to rural and distressed communities. According to the Tax Foundation, permanence for the bill's 4 cost recovery provisions I've just reviewed would more than double the long-run economic effect. The National Association of Manufacturers predicts $248 billion in economic growth will come from the manufacturing sector alone, along with over 1 million jobs and over $100 billion in new wages. The National Federation of Independent Businesses says that making the small business deduction permanent will create 1.2 million jobs over 10 years, growing to 2.4 million jobs in the long run. That growth also means more federal revenue created right along the way. And the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that the tax legislation alone, this tax legislation alone, will drive more than $2 trillion in offsetting deficit reduction, thanks to permanent provisions that power economic growth and incentivize investment. Over a 10-year window, with this legislation in effect, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that debt as a share of GDP will fall to 94%, compared to 117% if the Trump tax cuts expire. And this chart is important to look at. This is what happens to our deficit if we pass this tax legislation and grow our economy. And this is what happens if we don't. The red line is what happens if we don't. Over a 10-year window with this legislation in effect, as this chart shows, the estimate is 94% compared to 117% if the Trump tax cuts expire. So while my colleagues on the other side complain and complain that we will not let taxes go up, this is what will happen if they do go up. Far from adding to the deficit, this legislation will finally put us on a sound financial footing as we power growth and curb spending. For those who claim that this bill will add over $4 trillion to the deficit, it bears repeating. Preventing a $4 trillion tax hike is not the same as deficit spending. And those who say that we should let a $4 trillion tax hike go into effect to pay down the national debt, every tax increase that Congress has adopted for as long as I can remember was not used to pay down the national debt. It was used to increase spending. And that's exactly what is going to happen if the Democrats have their way and force this tax hike to happen. It was used by Congress to spend more money, not to reduce debt. Extending current tax policy means that tax revenue as a percent of GDP will remain relatively unchanged. We do not have a revenue problem in America. We have a spending problem. That's why we asked JCT to score this legislation under a more realistic scenario using a current policy baseline. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that making the Trump tax cuts permanent, combined with other Trump administration pro-growth policies like regulatory reform and so forth, it will increase federal revenues by more than $4 trillion, far more than offsetting any deficit estimates. When combined with the $1.6 trillion in spending reductions, this bill represents historic savings for taxpayers, far exceeding the spending reductions in the past by hundreds of billions of dollars. And I want to look at this chart. I've talked a lot about tax cuts and protecting against tax increases and economic growth that happens from that. But reducing spending is another critical priority that we must address. And in addition to the pro-growth tax policy that I've just described, we cut spending by $1.6 trillion. This chart shows how other bills have tried to take a shot at reducing spending in the past. We far exceed any spending reduction bill that Congress has ever passed. We're paying attention to the revenue side, and we're paying attention to the spending side. To achieve this record level of savings, we are slashing President Biden's Green New Deal spending and promoting an America First energy policy. We are eliminating hundreds of billions of dollars of the Green New Deal subsidies, including ending wasteful credits like the EV tax credit. We stopped penalizing fossil fuels in favor of unreliable and expensive green energy, and instead support consistent energy sources, making energy affordable again. We are also rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in federal spending programs, as my colleague from South Carolina mentioned, like those that we have identified in Medicaid. This will not reduce benefits for those who are qualified and for whom Medicaid was intended. It will reduce waste, fraud, and abusive scams that are being used to get the American taxpayer to funnel money into states or into other programs. This program was created to help pregnant women, children, and seniors in America and those with disabilities. We are continuing to protect them. They will not lose benefits, and the politics of fear that you hear constantly are simply false. But in recent years, the Democrats have incentivized Medicaid to enroll healthy Americans and illegal immigrants, driving up costs for taxpayers and risking the program's sustainability for those who need it the most. This is what has happened. This is what's happening to the enrollment and the spending in Medicaid. The fate of this expansion is an unsustainable path and puts the future of the program at risk, including the United States federal debt. As spending has surged, so have inappropriate payments and ineligible enrollments, along with gimmicks and loopholes. People are alarmed by these statistics, but official reports indicate that the federal government made $543 billion in inappropriate Medicaid payments from 2015 through 2024. Some experts think that that number is closer to $1 trillion. That is what we are addressing in this legislation. We have the responsibility to ensure that programs like Medicaid work efficiently and effectively and remain financially viable for those for whom it was designed to help. For months, my Democrat colleagues have engaged in the politics of fear, warning that Republicans are going to rip this critical program from those most in need. Let me be clear. This legislation does not take Medicaid away from any recipients for whom the program was designed to help. Children, the elderly, the disabled or infirm, adults caring for children, and elderly relatives are protected by this bill. We would not be honoring our obligation to these recipients if we allow the program to continue to balloon, forcing vulnerable populations to compete for available resources with able-bodied adults who refuse to work. As one father recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal, Medicaid was created to help people like my son. He is 17, has severe autism and epilepsy, and needs constant attention. Yet thanks to Obamacare's Medicaid expansion, he is stuck on a multi-year waiting list for an in-home care, because able-bodied adults are competing for the same results. CBO estimates that over 1.4 million illegal aliens are receiving Medicaid benefits. I'm talking about those who are not United States citizens and are not legally in the United States, receiving Medicaid benefits, and pushing those like this man's 17-year-old son out of his opportunity to get access to those benefits. Brett Guthrie, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, correctly notes, every dollar misspent on illegal immigrants and ineligible individuals in the Medicaid program means less money going to our children, our pregnant women and mothers, individuals, and others who are disabled and seniors. Republicans are committed to preserving and strengthening Medicaid for the people Medicaid was intended to serve. That starts with making common sense reforms to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. This bill targets rampant fraud in the program by removing illegal aliens, deceased recipients, or those enrolled in multiple states. It eliminates wasteful spending by ensuring that Medicaid payments align with levels in Medicare and other spending programs, and increases the frequency of eligibility checks. It requires more personal accountability and promotes pathways to work for able-bodied adults. The work requirements proposed in this legislation are simple. Many people are amazed that they're so easy to meet and yet so rigorously opposed. If you are an able-bodied adult without dependents, you can qualify for taxpayer-funded Medicaid by spending 20 hours per week working or participating in work training or going to school or participating in community service or volunteer work. The majority of Americans agree that these rules are responsible guardrails to protect a program that was designed to protect America's most vulnerable Americans. The bill also corrects abusive practices by freezing and reducing provider taxes, a financial gimmick used by states to increase federal spending that they receive. For those concerned about funding for rural hospitals during the transition back to responsible funding levels, the legislation creates a bridge funding system to help stabilize rural hospitals and enhance their long-term financial solvency. And while Democrats claim Republicans are slashing Medicaid spending, the reality is that even with these reforms, Medicaid spending is projected to continue to grow by billions of dollars over the next 10 years. Only in Washington is a smaller increase in spending considered a cut. In reality, these reforms will improve, protect, and preserve Medicaid for the most vulnerable Americans. We've had a very robust debate over how to best deliver on President Trump's agenda, and I'm proud of what we achieved in this legislation. The tax provisions in our bill, from permanent extension of the lower tax rate to the increased child tax credit to the permanent tax relief for businesses, will deliver financial security for American families and grow our economy. The health care provisions will protect and preserve Medicaid for the Americans that the program was designed to serve. And while more work remains, this bill's economic growth, combined with deficit reduction that we have in it, finally puts our country on a much better fiscal trajectory. Speaking of work, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to thank the excellent staff from the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Senate Legislative Council for the hard work and countless hours they have put in to get us to this point. Some of them have been working with us on these provisions for years, and we greatly appreciate your partnership in this effort. I ask unanimous consent to have these individuals' names printed in the record. Thank you. I also have to thank my incredible staff who have foregone sleep over the past several months to provide timely, indispensable insight, facts, legislative text, counsel, and so much more. Without them, we would not be at this point and ready to deliver this much needed growth-focused policy for the American people. I ask unanimous consent to have the names of my entire Finance Committee staff printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Even with all that, and all that we accomplish in this legislation, there are dozens of additional good ideas, smart policies, and common sense reforms that we were not able to include today. And I commit to working with my colleagues to advance those goals as well as we move forward. But today's historic legislation is more than a good start and will pay dividends for American families, extending good tax policy, delivering targeted relief, and reining in wasteful spending as achieved in this bill is the best way to restore economic prosperity and opportunity for all Americans. I look forward to getting it to the President's desk as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.